There's a moment, right before you understand something that changes you forever, where everything goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind you get on a Sunday morning when the air smells like rain and coffee and nothing bad has ever happened. I mean the other kind. The kind where your brain already knows what's coming and it's trying to protect you from it by shutting down everything else. That's the quiet I got the first time I heard Gresh speak. I want to be careful with how I tell this story because it matters. The details matter. The small things, the way his breathing sounded, the way he kept touching the scar along his collar ridge, the way he'd pause mid-sentence and look out the porthole like he expected something to come through the dark and take him, all of it matters. So let me go back to the beginning, the actual beginning, the way it really happened. My name is Corvin Dale. I was a field archivist for the Interstellar War Crimes Documentation Unit, IWCDU. If you want the acronym, though nobody ever called it that out loud because it sounds like something you'd cough up during a bad cold. We called it the unit. Simple as that. The unit was created 7 years into the war. That's the galactic sovereignty conflict. For anyone reading this who somehow wasn't alive during those years, though I can't imagine how that's possible, when it became clear that both sides were doing things that needed to be recorded. Not necessarily to prosecute, not always to punish, sometimes just to know. Sometimes just so the universe would have a document somewhere that said, this happened, this was real, someone saw it. I'd been with the unit for 3 years when they sent me to Voss Station. Voss was a neutral corridor installation, one of about 40 scattered through the Kepler Belt region, maintained jointly by the non-aligned systems under the Sovereignty Armistice Articles. Think of it like a way station, a place where things between the stars could stop and breathe for a moment. Ships refueled there, diplomatic couriers transferred there, and sometimes when the war churned up wreckage, survivors ended up there. That's what happened with Gresh. His full designation, because Vethkari don't use names the way we do, not exactly, was Gresh Vua Tamorin of the 3rd Tributary Cluster, which in their language carries about 40 different layers of meaning related to lineage and honor standing and military rank. But he'd been calling himself Gresh for 8 months by the time I arrived. He said a human nurse on the station had started using it because she couldn't manage the full pronunciation, and after a while it just stuck. He said it with something that might have been affection, maybe even fondness. I noticed that right away, that he used words like that, stuck, human idioms, small ones, like he'd been carrying them around in his pockets and didn't realize it until he reached in looking for something else. The station itself was something you had to see to understand, and even then you mostly just stood there squinting. Voss was built in layers, literally, physically, in concentric rings that rotated at slightly different speeds to maintain varied gravity environments for the species living in each section. The outermost ring was 0G, used mostly for cargo and fuel transfer. Then you had the mid-rings, which ran at about 0.6 standard, comfortable for most of the sovereignty species, the Vethkari, the Dur, the Pelani. And then the inner ring, the one that rotated fastest, that ran at almost exactly 1G, that was where the humans on the station lived. It was always warmer in the inner ring. I noticed that the first time I walked through the transition corridor. The air smelled different too, like something cooking always at any hour. Someone on the station had figured out that if you ran a small kitchen near the main ventilation intake, the smell would circulate through most of the corridor, and it made the whole place feel less like a pressurized metal tube floating in the void, and more like somewhere people actually chose to be. I don't know who figured that out, but I thought about them a lot during those weeks. The Medwing was in the transition zone between the mid-ring and the inner ring, a deliberate choice, the station commander told me, because they'd found it reduced recovery times. Something about the variable gravity doing something useful for certain types of tissue repair. I didn't understand the medicine. I just knew the Medwing smelled like antiseptic and something floral that, one of the Pelani nurses grew in a small planter by the main nursing station, and that the light in there was soft and yellow and made everyone look like they were in an old photograph. Gresh was in room 14. I stood outside the door for almost 5 minutes before I went in. Not because I was afraid exactly. I'd interviewed dozens of survivors by then. Soldiers, civilians, aid workers. I'd heard things that kept me from sleeping. I knew the weight of what these conversations cost. But something felt different about this one, and I couldn't name it then. I can name it now. It was the reports. In the 2 weeks before I arrived, the station's medical team had flagged Gresh's case as a priority referral to the unit. Not because of what had happened to him, specifically. Because of what he kept saying. He kept saying, "You don't understand what humans are." He said it to the nurses. He said it to the station doctor. He said it to the cargo worker who'd found him drifting in a survival pod in the outer belt and dragged him in. He said it quietly, not like someone ranting, not like someone unhinged, like someone who had looked at something the rest of the universe hadn't looked at yet and was still trying to figure out how to describe the shape of it. "You don't understand what humans are." I knocked on the door. He was sitting up when I came in. Not lying in the med-berth the way I'd expected, sitting in the chair beside it, wrapped in a thermal blanket looking out the porthole. He was tall, even seated. The Vethkari are always tall, bilateral symmetry like humans, but longer in the torso, shorter in the legs, with a secondary joint in each arm that makes them look, at first glance, like their elbows bend the wrong way. His skin, their surface membrane, technically, though the station staff called it skin, was a deep blue-gray, the color of a storm cloud right before it breaks open. Along his collar ridge, where the scarring was, it faded to something paler, almost silver. He turned when I came in. His eyes, 4 of them, arranged in a slight arc across the upper face, caught the light. The outer 2 were for wide field vision, passive. The inner 2 were the ones that focused, and they focused on me with a steadiness that made me feel, briefly, like I was the one being documented. "Archivist," he said. His standard was very good. Not perfect, he had a slight tendency to front-stress syllables that should have been back-stressed, and certain consonant clusters cost him, but good. Clear. Careful. "That's me," I said. "Corvin Dale, I appreciate you agreeing to speak with me." "I requested this," he said. "I asked your unit specifically." I hadn't known that. The intake paperwork hadn't mentioned it. "All right," I said. "Then I appreciate you being willing to wait." Something moved across his expression, not quite a smile. The Vethkari face doesn't smile the way ours does, but something close. An easing, like a door opening slightly. "Sit down, Archivist," he said. "What I'm going to tell you is going to take a while, and I've been waiting a long time to tell someone who will actually write it down." I sat down. I turned on my recorder, and Gresh Vua Tamorin of the 3rd Tributary Cluster started talking. He started not with the battle, not with the Warfront. He started 8 months earlier when his ship, a Sovereignty Patrol cruiser called the Tessevar Reach, was assigned to a sector of contested space near the Brennan Corridor. "You have to understand what we expected," he said. "We had intelligence assessments, detailed ones. Our analysts had been studying the human military capacity for 3 years by then. We had material on their vessels, weapon yields, propulsion signatures, range limitations. We had behavioral profiles, tactical tendency data. We had projected them, very thoroughly." He paused, looked at the porthole. "We were confident." The word came out like he was pronouncing a verdict on something. Like confident was the name of a mistake he'd made. The projection was that human forces would defend the Brennan Corridor with moderate intensity. They valued that sector, resource extraction infrastructure mostly, some logistics hubs. We expected resistance. We expected to take losses. But we expected it to resolve within 17 cycles. 17 cycles in Vethkari Standard Time, was about 11 days in hours. What happened? I asked. He turned from the porthole and looked directly at my inner eyes. At me, really. The way people look at you when they're about to say something true. Day 4, he said. That's when we first understood that our models were wrong. He described it the way you describe something you've seen in a dream that doesn't have a name. The Tessevar Reach was part of a 12-ship formation, standard sovereignty battle cluster, staggered in 3 tiers for defense in depth. They'd come out of transit near the 3rd Brennan waypoint and immediately begun moving to engage the human defensive positions. The human positions, according to their intelligence, should have been a frigate screen backed by a pair of heavy carriers and some orbital defense platforms. Established doctrine, the kind of setup you could model and respond to in your sleep. What they found was something else. The frigates were there, Gresh said. The carriers too, but they weren't arranged the way we expected. They weren't defending the infrastructure. He leaned forward slightly. The thermal blanket shifted. I could see more of the scarring along his collar ridge. It ran down into the shoulder, deep, the kind of scar that comes from heat from close-range weapons discharge. They were arranged, he said slowly, like they were inviting us in. I felt something move in my chest, not fear exactly. Something adjacent to it. They opened a lane, he said, right through the middle of their formation. Our lead commander, Fleet Primus Vareth, if your records want a name, he saw it as an error, a mistake in their positioning. He took the lane. He advanced through it. He accelerated through it. Gresh's voice was quiet. He thought they'd miscalculated, that they'd left themselves exposed, that we were going to punch straight through to the carriers and it would be over in hours instead of days. He stopped. I waited. The lane closed behind us, he said. The frigates repositioned, not randomly, precisely, in exactly the configuration you would need to trap a force that had just committed to a forward push. The carriers came up from beneath the ecliptic. Platforms we hadn't detected on initial scan powered up. They'd been running cold, do you understand? Running cold for days, probably, waiting. It was a trap, I said. It was a taut trap, he said. That's what I keep trying to explain and nobody seems to understand the difference. It wasn't just that they tricked us. It's that they knew us well enough to know exactly what we would do when we saw a gap. They understood sovereignty tactical doctrine. They had studied it. They had built a situation that would trigger our doctrine like a mechanism, like pressing a button. He sat back, pressed his hand flat against his thigh. Something in the gesture was steadying. We thought we were hunting, he said. We were the ones being hunted. He talked for almost 4 hours that first session. I'll give you the shape of what he described, the broad strokes, because the full tactical account takes up 47 pages of the formal archive submission, and most of it is coordinates and vessel designations that won't mean anything unless you were there. What matters, what Gresh kept returning to, what I could see was the real weight he was carrying, wasn't the tactics. The tactics were just the surface. What was underneath was something harder to name. He described the battle that followed the trap closing. His formation, the 12 ships, found themselves bracketed, with the frigate screen behind them and the carriers cutting off retreat, while the orbital platforms began firing from fixed angles that had clearly been calculated in advance. What should have been a devastating position for the humans had been inverted into a killing ground for the sovereignty fleet. And yet, the sovereignty ships fought back. Of course they did. 12 warships don't just roll over, even when they're surprised. Vareth reorganized the formation in under 2 minutes, which Gresh said was impressive even under those conditions, and began a push toward the weakest point in the new human positioning. They were taking heavy fire. 3 ships were already running damaged. But they were moving, adapting, not breaking. And then the human boarding parties arrived. I did not know, Gresh said carefully, that humans conducted close-quarters boarding actions against vessels under combat conditions. It was not considered a viable strategy. You need to cross the void between vessels while both ships are maneuvering under fire. You need to breach the hull of a ship whose crew knows you're coming. The casualty projections for such an operation are. He stopped, shook his head. In Vethkari military doctrine, boarding is a last resort. For a disabled vessel, for a stationary target, not in an active engagement. Our analysts had looked at human special operations capacity and concluded that their boarding doctrine was similar to ours. Circumstantial, limited. But it wasn't, I said. They came across in magnetic clamp craft, he said. Small, faster than our point defense systems were calibrated to track because they were targeting larger threats. They hit 3 ships in the formation simultaneously. One of them was the Tessevar Reach. He touched the scar along his collar ridge. I didn't say anything. 14 of them, he said. 14 humans came through a breach in Section 7. I was in the adjacent section during the damage control response. We had a fire suppression cascade failure and I was part of the emergency crew. He paused. I am telling you this because it explains why I was there, why I saw what I saw. It wasn't my post. I was there because of the cascade failure. I understand, I said. 14 humans, he said again, against a crew of 260. In a ship that still had power, still had internal security systems active, still had armed Vethkari security personnel throughout the vessel. He looked at me, all 4 eyes, that steadiness again. Archivist, he said, they took the engine room in 6 minutes. I need to stop here for a moment because I'm writing this the way I experienced it. And the way I experienced it, there was a moment right there, at 6 minutes, where the room felt different. Where the air felt thicker or thinner, I couldn't have said which. Where something my body understood before my brain did made the hairs on my forearms stand straight up. 6 minutes. I'd read the casualty projections for human boarding operations. I'd seen what our own analysts estimated for sovereignty ships. 6 minutes was less than a third of the lowest end estimate. How? I asked. And I heard it in my own voice, not the professional archivist voice, not the careful documentation voice. Just me, just genuine, open human how. Gresh was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That is what I have been trying to understand ever since. That is the question that kept me alive in that survival pod. I had something to figure out. I had to know, and I have been thinking about it for 8 months." He shifted in the chair, pulled the blanket tighter. "The short answer," he said, "is that they were not afraid." He said it simply, factually, but there was something in the simplicity that hit harder than if he'd shouted it. "Not afraid," I said. "Fear," he said, "is a biological regulator. For most species, for us, fear modulates action. When the threat assessment exceeds a certain threshold, fear redirects resources from aggression to survival, to retreat, to self-preservation. This is not weakness. This is function. It is a system working correctly." He paused. "Humans have this system. I know they do. The physiology is documented. They have the same cascade, the adrenaline, the stress response, the threat detection heightening, all of it." He leaned forward. "But something in their condition, and I don't mean their individual conditions, I mean something in what they had been through, what the war had made of them. Something had altered the output of that system. They still felt the fear. I am certain of that. I could see it in their faces, the ones I was close enough to see. I am not describing fearless humans, archivist. I am describing something far more frightening than fearlessness." He stopped. I waited. "I am describing humans who felt the fear and came forward anyway." He described the 14 soldiers in pieces. Not their names. He didn't know their names. Not then, though I'd find some of them later in the post-action records. He described them the way you describe things you observed in fragments, from across a chaotic space, while also trying to do other things and stay alive. A woman, he knew she was a woman by the secondary indicators, the proportional differences, who moved through the Section 7 corridor without cover, drawing fire toward herself deliberately while two of her team moved under the distraction she was creating. Not a feint, not even a tactical maneuver exactly, something more instinctive than that, a sacrifice of her own exposure to protect two others. He said she was hit twice, glancing strikes from the internal security response, and kept moving. A man who reached a locked blast door and spent 40 seconds working the manual override while standing in an active fire corridor. 40 seconds. Gresh's voice changed when he described this, went slower, like he was measuring the seconds himself even now. 40 seconds is a very long time to stand in a fire corridor. He got it open, Gresh said. A small team that reached the engineering crew's shelter point, where 22 Vethkari crew members had sealed themselves in behind a reinforced door, and instead of cutting through immediately, spent 90 seconds doing something at the external panel. When the door opened, the crew inside found their internal communications had been disabled, and a translation unit was broadcasting a single repeating message in standard. Sit down. Don't move. You will not be harmed. They took the time, Gresh said. In the middle of all of that, with everything happening, with the clock running and the battle ongoing and the ship still fighting, they took 90 seconds to make sure those 22 crew members understood they were not going to be killed. He shook his head, something in the gesture that might have been wonder and might have been something darker, hard to say. They were efficient, he said, but they were not cruel. Do you understand what that combination costs? In that environment, under those conditions, the resources it takes to be both of those things at once. I didn't say anything, because I thought I understood, but I also thought maybe I didn't, not really, not the way he did, because I hadn't been there. They took the engine room, he said again, 6 minutes. 3 of the 14 were injured. None of them died. And when the Tessevar Reach went dead in space, when our weapons went offline and our drives went quiet, one of them, just one, a young man, couldn't have been more than 25 by your species' reckoning, sat down on the deck of our engine room against the coolant housing and put his head back and closed his eyes. Gresh paused. His hands were shaking, he said quietly. I watched him from where I was across the compartment. His hands were shaking, not before, not during, after, just after. He touched the scar at his collar. That was the moment I understood something had changed in the universe, he said. Not in that room, not in the war, in the universe. The moment I understood that something had come into being in the galaxy that we, none of us, not the sovereignty, not the Pelani, not anyone who has been out here longer than humans, that none of us had ever seen before. What was that? I asked. He looked at me. An animal, he said, that had taught itself to be something else, not stopped being an animal, not transcended it, kept all of it, every instinct, every reflex, every old fear, and then layered something new on top, something deliberate, something chosen. He sat back. That is what humans are, archivist. That is what nobody understands, and that is what I need you to write down. We broke after that. He was tired. I could see it even across the species gap, the particular kind of tired that comes from saying true things out loud. I went back to my quarters in the inner ring and sat on the edge of my bunk for a while without doing anything. Outside my small porthole, the Kepler belt spread out in all directions, rocks and ice and old light, the debris field of something that never quite became what it was supposed to be. There was a human ship docked at Voss's outer ring. I could see its running lights from where I sat, green and white, and a small red indicator near the stern that blinked every 4 seconds with the regularity of a heartbeat. I thought about what Gresh had said. An animal that had taught itself to be something else. I thought about the young soldier in the engine room with his shaking hands, how he'd held it together through all of it, all the fear, all the fire, all the violence, and then let himself shake after. Like there was a place in him that knew, now it's safe to be human for a second. I thought about that being a choice. A conscious, deliberate choice made under fire in a hostile environment in the middle of a battle by someone who was 25 years old and scared and did it anyway. And then I thought about the fact that there were thousands of them, tens of thousands, maybe more, all making versions of that same choice on 1,000 different fronts every single day of this war. I didn't sleep well that night, but it wasn't the bad kind of not sleeping. It was the kind where you're sitting with something too big to hold all at once, and your brain is trying to find a container large enough, and it keeps failing, but the failing itself feels like something important. The next morning, Gresh was already in the chair when I arrived. He'd been there a while, I think. He had a cup of something warm in his hands, one of the Vethkari herbal preparations the medical staff had started stocking, and he was looking at the porthole again, but differently than the day before. Less like he was watching for threats, more like he was just watching. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," I said. Something eased in his expression. "I slept better last night than I have in 8 months, he said. There is something about having said it to someone who is going to write it down, like it has moved from inside me to somewhere outside, somewhere else. A pause. I did not expect to feel that. "People sometimes don't," I said. "It's why the unit exists." He looked at the cup in his hands. "I want to tell you about the second engagement," he said. "The one at Brennan Prime. That is where I finally," he stopped, started again. "That is where I understood the full scope of it." "Whenever you're ready," I said. He took a slow breath. "Let me tell you about Sergeant Vila," he said. And the second part of his account began. Sergeant Amara Vila. He'd learned her name later, from the post-action records that circulated through the neutral information networks. At the time, she was just a presence, a particular human in a particular place, who did particular things that Gresh found himself unable to stop thinking about. The second engagement, Brennan Prime, happened 46 days after the first. By then, the 12-ship formation was 3 ships. The Tessevar Reach had been recaptured by sovereignty forces during the battle's final phase. The human boarding teams had been extracted, the ship's drives restarted, the crew freed. But the Reach was badly damaged, limping, running at partial capacity. 2 other ships were similarly compromised. Vareth, who was still alive, which Gresh said surprised him, had regrouped the surviving formation at a resupply point and called in reinforcements. 9 additional ships. He had a new plan. He was going to take Brennan Prime directly. A frontal assault, overwhelming force, accepting losses in exchange for a decisive breakthrough. Gresh said, "I want you to understand that Vareth was not stupid. He was a good commander. What he was, what we all were, was trapped inside a model that had stopped being true. Brennan Prime was a transit hub. Massive infrastructure, dock rings, processing stations, fuel depot arrays, a civilian population of somewhere between 80 and 100,000 depending on which count you used, strategically vital, and defended. The human defense force at Brennan Prime was smaller than the sovereignty assault formation. Gresh estimated from the engagement data that they were outnumbered approximately 2 to 1. The installation's orbital defense platforms had been partially disabled in an earlier engagement. The human heavy carriers were operating on reduced capacity. On paper, Vareth's plan should have worked. "We came out of transit in formation," Gresh said. "Full formation, all 12 ships leading with shields at maximum, weapons ready. It was," he paused. "It was the most impressive display of force I had seen. We were going to end it, right there. We were going to break Brennan Prime and it was going to be over." He stopped. "They let us get close," he said. "Very close. Close enough that the installation was visible on direct optics. Close enough that I could see the dock rings." "And then," I asked. The frequency came through on standard military band, he said. Open channel. Unencrypted, broadcasting to the entire formation. He was quiet for a moment. A single human voice, he said. Female, calm, not aggressive, just calm, like someone reading a weather report. He looked at me. She said, Sovereignty Formation, this is the defense coordinator at Brennan Prime. I want you to look at your scanner readouts. Really look at them. Because what you're about to do is going to cost you more than Brennan Prime is worth, and I want you to have that information before you make a decision you can't undo. I waited. And then, Gresh said slowly, things that had not appeared on our scanners appeared on our scanners. He described it with the precision of someone who has gone over and over it in his mind, who has mapped every detail in the attempt to understand it fully. The platforms that had appeared disabled, they'd been damaged, genuinely, but not as extensively as the sovereignty assessment had concluded. The human engineers had been working on them in the intervening 46 days, not just repairing them, modifying them. The power signatures were different. The firing arcs were different. Whatever they'd been doing in those 6 weeks had changed what those platforms could do. The frigates that had appeared to be in a standard defensive formation, they weren't in a defensive formation. They were in something that Gresh, when he described it, used a phrase I had to ask him to translate twice. It came out, roughly, as a closing hand. Like the formation was a hand, partially open, waiting to close around whatever moved into it. And the carriers, the ones running at reduced capacity, had apparently used that reduced capacity period as cover. Because what the sovereignty formation scanners now showed was that the carriers were not at reduced capacity anymore. They had been. They weren't now. Someone, Gresh said, had shown us exactly what they wanted us to see for 46 days. They had maintained the appearance of a weakened position across all our scanning frequencies while rebuilding and repositioning beneath it. He shook his head. I do not know how you fake a carrier's power signature across a 6-week period at that level of detail. The technical requirements alone, he stopped. That is not the point. The point is they did it. The voice on the channel, I said, Sergeant Vila. Sergeant Vila, he confirmed. Defense coordinator, which I found out later is not typically a senior rank. She was not fleet admiral, she was not a grand commander. She was a sergeant, a middle rank, an operational rank. But she was running the defense, I said. She was designing the defense, he said. The senior officers, the fleet admiral was on one of the carriers, had given her operational authority for the Brennan Prime installation defense because she was the one who understood it best. And she had spent 46 days building a trap. He touched the scar at his collar ridge. She gave Vareth a choice, he said. That's what strikes me most. She didn't just close the trap, she called first. She told him what he was looking at. She gave him the option to not do it. Why would she do that? I asked. He looked at me with something that was, I think, close to sadness. Because she didn't want to kill 12 ships full of people if she didn't have to, he said. That's the only answer I have been able to find. She had one. She could have just let it happen, let us come in and destroyed us. But she called first, open channel, gave us the picture, because she didn't want to destroy us if there was a version where we chose differently. Silence. Did Vareth retreat? I asked. Gresh was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. That's the end of part 1. Vareth did not retreat. And what happened in the following hours? The Battle of Brennan Prime, the final hour, what Gresh witnessed from the damaged tertiary observation deck of the Tessevar Reach as the trap closed around them, that is part 2. But before I write part 2, I want to say something. As an archivist, as a person who has spent years listening to people describe the worst things they've seen, Gresh's testimony is the most important thing I have ever recorded. Not because of the tactics, not even because of the battles. Because of what it says about the nature of the thing we're in. This war, this conflict, this strange encounter between a species that has been in the galaxy for a long time and a species that has been here for almost none of it. Gresh said something, right at the end of our first session, that I didn't include in its proper place because it didn't fit there, but I want to include it now. I asked him after everything he described, after 6 minutes and shaking hands and Sergeant Vila's open-channel broadcast, I asked him, "Are you afraid of humans?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "No, but I think the universe should pay much closer attention to them." He paused. "Not because they are dangerous," he said carefully. "Many things are dangerous. What makes humans worth paying attention to is that they are dangerous in a direction. They are not random. They are not simply destructive. They are oriented toward something." "Toward what?" I asked. He looked out the porthole, the star field, the old light. "I do not know yet," he said quietly. "But I have a feeling that when we understand it, when all of us out here finally understand what it is that humans are oriented toward, that is the moment everything will change." End of Part 1. Testimony continues in Part 2, The Warfront. Archive reference: IWA 7741 VOSS/Corvin-Dale, Field Archivist, IWCDU. Part 2, The WARFRONT. Document style: first-person witness account. Recorded testimony: Interstellar War Crimes Archive, File Ref. IWA 7741 VOSS/continuation. Session 2, Day 2, VOS Station, Neutral Corridor, Kepler Belt. The second session started differently than the first. I arrived at room 14 to find Gresh not in the chair, not at the porthole, but standing at the small basin in the corner of the room, doing something with his hands that I didn't immediately recognize. It took me a moment to realize he was arranging something small stones or something that looked like stones on the edge of the basin shelf. 5 of them, different sizes, placed with care, with deliberateness, at specific intervals. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't look up right away. "In Vethkari practice," he said, "there is something, the closest translation in your language might be memorial spacing. When you are about to speak of the dead, you create a space that acknowledges them, so that the telling doesn't become just a telling, so that the people you are about to describe remain, for the duration of the account, something other than data." He set the last stone. "I was going to tell you about Brennan Prime," he said. "I wanted to do this first." I sat down. I turned on the recorder, and I did not say anything for a moment because it felt important to let the space he'd made be a space. Then he turned from the basin and came to the chair, and we continued. "Here is what happened at Brennan Prime when Vareth said no." Gresh said he knew, even as Vareth's order to advance came through the formation's command channel, that it was wrong. Not tactically. He said he didn't have the full tactical picture in that moment. He knew it was wrong the way you sometimes know things before you have the evidence for them. Instinct. Something in the quality of Sergeant Vila's voice. Something in the way she'd called them at all. "She didn't sound uncertain," he said. "She sounded like someone who has already won and is offering the losing side an opportunity to understand that before the losing becomes expensive. That is a very specific kind of confidence." I recognized it. Not from a military context, from negotiations I had observed between tributary clusters during my early service. Someone who holds all the ground and still offers you a door out. Vareth saw it differently. Vareth saw, or chose to see, a bluff, a desperate gambit by a weakened force trying to ward off an overwhelming assault with nothing but words and a sensor display. Vareth advanced. The Tessevar reach was in the formation's second tier, not the lead edge. That was 3 ships, the fresh reinforcements, the ones with full shielding. Gresh's ship was roughly 4 minutes behind the leading edge at combat approach speed. Those 4 minutes, he said, were the longest of his life. "The platforms fired first," he said, "the modified ones." And I say modified because what came from them was not the standard discharge profile we had in our records. The energy signature was different. The dispersal pattern was different. Our forward shields, our ship's shields, which are designed against documented sovereignty system weapons, they did not perform the way they were supposed to perform against this output. He pressed his hands together, a Vethkari gesture I'd come to associate with emphasis, or with the effort of precision, of getting the words right. They had modified the platform weapons to exploit gaps in our shielding architecture, he said. Gaps our own engineers knew about, gaps that were in reports, in internal sovereignty engineering documents, which means... He stopped. Which means they had access to our internal engineering documentation, I said. Which means they had access to our internal engineering documentation, he confirmed. Yes, I do not know how, I have my guesses, but what matters is, they had studied our shielding, they had found its structural weaknesses, and they had spent 46 days building weapons specifically calibrated to those weaknesses. The lead ships went down in under 90 seconds. Not destroyed, Gresh was careful about this distinction. 2 of them lost primary weapons and shields and went dead in space. 1 broke apart. The Reach and the surrounding formation had seconds to process what they were seeing before the frigates began to move. The closing hand. I watched it happen, he said. From the second-tier position I could see the full geometry of it. The frigate arms coming in from 2 sides, the carrier group moving up from below the ecliptic, the same movement as the first engagement but scaled. Larger, more precise, as if the first time had been a practice run. In a way it was, I said. He considered that. Yes, I think that is right. The first engagement was information. They were learning us, learning how we moved, how we adapted, what we defaulted to under pressure. And 46 days later, they had incorporated all of that. The HFY Reach began taking fire from the repositioned platforms, not the modified weapon type, the standard type, which Gresh said he thought was deliberate. They could handle standard. It was damaging but not catastrophic. It kept them busy, it kept them in place, while other things happened. The second wave of boarding parties came at 11 of our ships simultaneously, he said. 11, not 3 like the first engagement, 11. By this point, he said, our tactical advisors had theoretically updated their assessments of human boarding operations. We had new protocols, new countermeasures, internal defensive positions, revised point defense calibration, crew distribution changes that were supposed to prevent a small force from isolating engine access. Supposed to, I said. The humans had apparently obtained the updated protocols, he said flatly, or deduced them. Because the boarding approach at Brennan Prime circumvented our countermeasures in ways that suggested they knew what the countermeasures were. The silence in the room was very complete. How do you fight that? I asked, and I meant it as an honest question, not a rhetorical one. Gresh looked at me. You don't, he said. Not the way you're thinking, not tactically. You can't outmaneuver an opponent who already knows your next move before you make it. You can't counter defenses against counters you haven't developed yet. You can't. He stopped. You have to change something more fundamental than your tactics. What do you mean? I mean you have to change what you are, he said. And that is very hard to do in the middle of a battle. He described the hour that followed the boarding actions beginning. The HFY Reach received its second boarding party, different entry point from the first engagement, a section near the upper decks that had been designated a low-risk zone in the updated defensive protocols. 6 humans this time, smaller than the first team, but what they did in those upper decks bought time for the 2 closing frigate arms to complete the encirclement. Gresh was not in the upper decks when they arrived. He was in a command relay station in the ship's core, part of the damage control architecture, a position he'd been assigned specifically because of what had happened in the first engagement, because he had experience with the ship's emergency systems under duress. What he could see from the relay station was the ship's internal monitor network, partial, damaged from the platform fire, but still functional in about 60% of the vessel. He watched the 6 humans move through the upper deck on the monitor feeds. They moved differently from the first team, he said. The first team was urgent, purposeful, but there was an energy to it, a driving forward quality. These 6 were slower, more deliberate. They were not in a hurry. Why not? I asked. Because they didn't need to be, he said. The first team needed speed. Surprise was their primary advantage. These 6 already knew how the Reach was organized. They had the blueprints. I am certain of it. They moved like people who had walked the corridors before in their minds 100 times. They knew where they were going. One of them, the one who appeared to be directing the others, not by rank insignia Gresh could read, but by the way the others oriented toward them, stopped twice along the corridor. Once at an intersection where 3 of the Vethkari crew had set up a defensive position. Once at a sealed section door that should have been secure. At the intersection, the directing human did something Gresh said he had never seen before, and has not been able to fully explain to the station's military analysts. She stopped, he said, outside the intersection, her team stacked behind her. The defensive position was around the corner. Our crew couldn't see her, she couldn't see them, and she waited. How long? 3 minutes, he said, which is a very long time to wait when you are aboard an enemy vessel in an active engagement. What was she waiting for? I asked. For them to make noise, he said. For a comm signal. A voice, a movement. She was mapping them by sound and signal before she moved. In 3 minutes she had constructed a picture of exactly where each crew member was and what each of them was doing. And then she moved. And she moved in a way that brought all 3 of them under control in under 20 seconds without killing any of them. How? By going around, he said. There is a maintenance access route, a small crawl passage that intersects the corridor from above. It's in the ship's schematic. She sent 2 of her team through the crawl passage, timed it, and came around from 2 angles simultaneously while a 3rd member of her team created a distraction at the corridor end. He shook his head slowly. 20 seconds. 3 crew members who were armed and in position and who had had 3 minutes to prepare. 20 seconds. I thought about the 20 seconds, about the 3 minutes of listening before it, about the ship's schematics. She'd planned that specific route, I said, in advance. She had planned multiple routes, he said. From everything I could see on the monitor network, she was choosing between prepared options at each decision point, as if she had gamed the entire ship interior before she stepped foot on it. He looked at the small stones on the basin shelf. That is what I keep coming back to, he said quietly. The preparation, not the courage, though there was courage, an enormous amount of it, not the training, not the capability, the preparation. The months of study, of imagining, of walking through an enemy vessel in your mind before you walk through it in person. That is not animal instinct. That is not reflex. That is something deeply, specifically human. The ability to project yourself forward in time and space, and live in that imagined future long enough to actually prepare for it. He talked about Sergeant Vila again. He'd seen her briefly in the engagement's final phase. The Tessevar Reach had been declared combat ineffective by its own command systems. Vareth, on his flagship, had issued a general retreat order, but the formation by that point was too deeply inside the closing hand. 3 ships made it out. The rest were captured or destroyed. And among the boarding parties across the formations, 11 ships, among all those humans crossing the void in magnetic clamp craft and breaching hulls and taking engine rooms and disabling weapons, there had been a coordinator. Not on any of the ships, coordinating from the installation itself, from Brennan Prime. Vila. The tactical feeds we were getting, which the humans were, apparently, also getting because they had penetrated our tactical communications. She was making real-time adjustments, Gresh said. 11 simultaneous boarding operations across 11 ships, coordinated from a fixed position, adjusting objectives in response to developments, redirecting resources, calling off an approach on one vessel when she determined the crew response was different from the modeled expectation, redirecting that team to a higher priority target. He paused. "Do you understand what that requires?" he said, cognitively. To hold 11 separate situations in your mind simultaneously, to be tracking each one in real time, to be making adjustment decisions for all of them while also managing the larger engagement picture. He stopped. "She was 28 years old," he said. "We found that out later. 28. She had been in the human military for 6 years. She had been coordinating large-scale operations for 3. 28 years old." I sat with that number for a moment. "What happened to her?" I asked. "She's alive," he said. "As of the last information available on neutral channels, still at Brennan Prime, still, I believe, doing exactly what she was doing then." He almost smiled, or something in him almost smiled. "I thought about sending her a message," he said. "When I was in the survival pod, I had a lot of time to think. I thought about what I would say." He paused. "I couldn't figure out the words. What do you say to someone who beat you so completely and so precisely that what you feel, looking back, is not anger or shame but something closer to wonder?" We talked, in the final hour of the session, about what came after the battle. The Tessevar Reach survived, badly damaged, structurally compromised but intact. Vareth was captured. The ship's crew was taken as prisoners of war and held in the Brennan Prime facility under standard interstellar conventions. Gresh was not with them at that point. In the chaos of the battle's final phase, the disabling of the ship's drives, the secondary fires that had spread through the forward sections, he had ended up separated from the main crew assembly and had made his way to a survival pod bay. Not deliberately, exactly. More following the emergency architecture the ship's systems were driving him toward. The pod launched, and then there was just dark. "I was in the pod for 19 days, he said, "before the Der cargo worker found me." 19 days in a survival pod. I've seen the standard specs for Vethkari emergency survival units. They're designed for 8 days with comfortable margins. He'd been in there for 19. "How?" I asked. "Rationing," he said simply, "careful rationing. And something I learned from watching humans under pressure." He stopped. "Compartmentalization, dealing with one thing at a time, not letting yourself think about the total duration, only the next interval, only the next 8 hours, then the next. It is a human cognitive strategy. I had observed it in the crew members I'd watched on the monitor network under fire. The way they narrowed their focus under stress, stayed in the immediate task instead of the total situation." He looked at his hands. "I spent 19 days in a survival pod using a technique I learned from watching my enemies," he said. "And I am alive because of it." He talked about his crew mates, the ones who'd been taken prisoner. He'd gotten information from the neutral networks while at Voss about their treatment. "According to the sovereignty observers who were permitted access," he said, "the prisoners of war at Brennan Prime were held in conditions that exceeded the minimum standards under interstellar conventions." He paused. "Exceeded. Not met. Exceeded. The facility had made specific accommodations for Vethkari physiological needs, the atmospheric composition, the light spectrum, the temperature gradients. The food provisions included what they could manage of Vethkari dietary requirements, though the supply chains were limited." He was quiet for a moment. "Vareth," he said, "was given access to communications to contact his family. This is not required under the conventions. It was a voluntary provision." Another pause. The humans also told the prisoners about the battle, he said. Not propaganda, facts. What had happened to the formation, which ships were captured, which were lost, who was alive. They said they understood it was important to know. He pressed his hands together. We destroyed 3 of their ships, he said. At Brennan Prime, we killed, he stopped. The final count I've seen in the neutral records is 412 human personnel, dead, in the engagement. 412. And then they gave Vareth calm access, he said, so he could tell his family he was alive. The room was very quiet. That is the terrifying truth, he said. That is what I asked your unit to come record, not the tactics, not the weapons modifications, not the compartmentalization or the preparation or the coordination. The thing I cannot stop thinking about is this. He looked at me with all 4 eyes. They are frightening because of how capable they are, how adaptive and prepared and precise. Yes, but what makes them truly different, what I have not seen anywhere else in this galaxy in my 23 years of military service, is that they remain in the middle of all of it human. They hold on to something that should not survive what they put themselves through. Some quality of caring about the individual, about the person in front of them, even the enemy person, even the person they are fighting. He stopped. That quality, he said, I have been trying to name it for 8 months. I am not sure I have your language for it, but in Vethkari there is a word Tessavar. It means, roughly, the light that continues to exist inside a structure after the structure has been through fire. A property of certain materials. They retain warmth after the heat source is gone. They remember the fire in the way they hold the residual warmth. He was quiet for a moment. Your species carries that, he said. Tessavar. Whatever happens to you, however much fire you go through, there is still warmth. Still the memory of what you are when things are good, held inside the structure of what you become when things are hard. He turned to look at the small stones on the basin shelf. I named this survival pod after that word, he said, when I was drifting. When I was rationing and compartmentalizing and using all the human techniques I had studied. I named the pod Tessavar in my mind because I wanted to remember what I was trying to get back to. He looked at the porthole, the stars. There are people on both sides of this war who are going to use what I've told you to build better weapons, he said. Better countermeasures, better traps, and I understand that. That is what records get used for sometimes. I know what I'm handing to the universe by talking to you. But you're still talking, I said. Because some things need to be in the record regardless of how they get used, he said. Because 40 years from now, or 400, someone is going to look back at this period and try to understand what humans were. And I want there to be a document somewhere, one document that says, they were not simply a military power. They were not simply adaptive or capable or frightening. He looked at me. They were something we did not have a category for, and the category they belong in, the one that had to be invented to fit them, starts not with what they can destroy, but with what they refuse to let go of while they are destroying it. I stayed at Voss Station for 11 more days after my sessions with Gresh concluded. There were other interviews, other testimonies. I did the work I was sent to do, but I kept coming back to room 14 not for official sessions, just to sit with him, to talk. About the Kepler belt, about his family back in the 3rd tributary cluster, about a particularly good meal the inner ring kitchen had produced that he'd been brought as part of a dietary experiment the station doctor was running. He was getting better, slowly physically, the way bodies come back from long damage. The color in his surface membrane was deepening, returning, the nurses said, toward his natural tone. He'd started doing some mobility work in the medwing corridor. He could walk the length of the wing without stopping. On my last day, he was sitting in the chair when I came in, as usual. But this time the porthole was open, cracked to the outer vacuum, the viewport. No actual atmosphere change, but the visual of open space immediate and close. He was looking at the human ship still docked at the outer ring, the one with the green and white running lights and the red blinker near the stern. "I've been watching that ship," he said, "for 3 weeks. I've noticed," I said. I thought at first that it made me uncomfortable, that there was a residual fear response. He was quiet for a moment, but I watched it long enough to realize that's not what it is. "What is it?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. "I think," he said finally, "I am trying to understand it, as a thing, as a physical object, because I keep expecting it to look different from the outside, to look like what I know it to contain. Like the experience of being inside a vessel, operated by humans, should change what the vessel looks like from out here." He turned from the porthole. "It doesn't, of course," he said. "It looks like a ship, metal and running lights and a red blinker, exactly what it is, nothing more." A pause. "But I know what's in there, and that knowing changes how I see the outside of it, even when the outside of it doesn't change." I thought about that on the shuttle back to the main transit hub. I thought about it for a long time, about the gap between the outside of a thing and what you know to be inside it, about how knowledge changes seeing. About a young soldier in an engine room with shaking hands. About Sergeant Vila at 28, holding 11 simultaneous engagements in her mind like light in her hands. About a survival pod named Tessevar drifting for 19 days in the Kepler belt, carrying one passenger who had decided, consciously, deliberately, the way humans had taught him, to deal with 1 8-hour interval at a time. About what it means to hold warmth after the fire. The last thing Gresh said to me, at the medwing door when I left, I want to get the words exactly right, because I've been saying them to myself since, like something I'm trying to memorize. He said, "I hope your war ends. I hope it ends before it changes too much of what is remarkable about your species. Because I have seen what this kind of fire does to materials over time, even to those that hold warmth best." He paused. "The Tessevar does not last forever," he said. "It is possible to burn out even the residual warmth. And what I have seen of humans, what I have told you, is a picture of humans who have not been burned out yet, who are still holding something, still choosing it." He looked at me the way he'd looked at me that first day, all 4 eyes, that steadiness. "I hope," he said, "someone on your side is paying attention to that, to how much it costs, to how much you are spending. Because the most frightening thing I can imagine about humans is not what happens if you lose. It's what happens if the fire goes on long enough that you stop choosing to hold the warmth." He turned and went back down the medwing corridor, past the Pelani nurse's planter, past the soft yellow light, past the numbered doors. I stood there for a moment. And then I walked out into the inner ring's warm air, where something was always cooking somewhere, and where the smell of it circulated through the corridors and made the whole place feel like somewhere someone had chosen to be. And I thought, we are still choosing it. I thought we have to keep choosing it. That's the terrifying truth the alien survivor revealed. Not about the Warfront. About us.